Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Richard, thank you for doing this. I was going to jump right in, but before I do, if I could do a quick, I could wait until the end to do the commercial, but I think I'm going to do it now, and then at the end they're going to ask, what was it again? If you value the kind of insight that you will receive from Richard Haass while he is here with us, you should know that he has a weekly newsletter. It is available to all on Substack. Just search his name, or it's called Home and Away. Called Home and Away. And special edition coming out, Trump's First 100 Days? Tomorrow. All right. Which is a good place for us to start. We heard of your background. We know that you've spent a career trying to make sense of what's happening in the world, and for a good part of that time actually working to change what's happening in the world. So I'm going to start with the question that has been hanging in the air here at Global Forum, which is it's American leadership. And we have a great debate coming up where we're going to be talking specifically about America First and what that means. But I'm going to ask you to just zoom out and offer big picture perspective, given your long and illustrious career. How does American leadership, how should American leadership matter when we're thinking about the challenges in the world? Ukraine, and obviously the challenges that matter so deeply to us, not only in Ukraine, but in Israel, the threat of Iran, given the role that the United States is playing, and then underlying all of this, the importance of democratic values throughout the world, and a time of rising authoritarianism in so many parts of the world. How does this all fit together? What role should the United States be playing? Bobby was right. We're looking for some sage guidance. We turn to you, Richard Haass. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Ted. It's good to be here. It's good to be back with this organization for whom I have enormous respect. I was once in your chair interviewing a former Secretary of State, and I asked him a big question like that, and he took about 40 minutes to give the answer. And I said, Mr. Secretary, when I invited you here for a question and answer session, I didn't realize you were going to take me so literally. I will resist that temptation. So let me just take two.
By the way, I spent a career in Congress. That would have been such a good line. I'm so.
You might still be there. Yeah, I know. It's but I'm just getting started. So let's take the second one first. Speakers always do that. I don't know why, but I will. So yeah, authoritarianism is a big danger in the world, but that's nothing new. In some ways, a lot of 20th century history is about struggle against authoritarianism. And the man who first ran the policy planning staff at the State Department, one of the great scholar diplomats of this or any other era, was George Kennan. And Kennan wrote about the theory of, developed the doctrine of containment. And his idea was the best way to deal with authoritarianism was to frustrate them at every turn. And that if you frustrated them at every turn, they wouldn't be able to realize their foreign policy aims, strengthen themselves through that. But also, sooner or later, the frustration would perhaps set in motion the seeds of their own demise. And if you think about the Cold War, it was 4 decades of American-led frustration of the Soviet Union. And then, among other things, that frustration certainly contributed to the environment which brought Mikhail Gorbachev to power and ultimately led to the unraveling of both the external empire that the Soviets maintained through force in Eastern Europe and the internal empire that was the Soviet Union itself. And I think that's the approach to authoritarianism today. We ought not to focus on bringing them down. We don't have that ability. In some cases, it could be risky to do so. We have other priorities, for example, maybe avoiding nuclear war or other conflicts. But we can frustrate their foreign policies, whether it's of Vladimir Putin and his war of aggression in Ukraine. That has been frustrated for over 3 years, should continue to be frustrated. We should make sure that China, if it turns to foreign policy conquest in the South China Sea or Taiwan, that they're frustrated. Iran ought to be frustrated, and I think the last year has been a salutary year for frustrating Iran's efforts to expand its or maintain its influence in the region and so forth. So I think we have something of a cookbook for dealing with authoritarians, and ultimately, I believe if that we continue to heighten their, frustrate them, I think their own internal contradictions can ultimately be their own demise. And that, I think, ought to be our playbook for dealing with them. I'm actually more worried about another trend, which is different but related, which is the rise of illiberalism. Authoritarianism is too big of a word. But if I see what's going on in Hungary, I see what's going on in Turkey, I see elements of it in this country, I see elements of it in Israel. Again, it's a spectrum. But I see the weakening of the fabric of democratic institutions, democratic norms, democratic governance. We can talk about it if you want in detail, the weakening of checks and balances and so forth. But that's what worries me, and that we do have more control over, and I think directly. And happy to go down that path if anyone wants to. Just very quickly, about your first point, let me just say this, and I'll do it from 30,000 feet. We have been the beneficiaries of a remarkable run of history. The last 8 decades are without parallel or precedent. If you think about what happened after World War II and the run of 8 decades, 80 years, the absence of great power conflict, when else can you find that? Cold War stayed cold, never turned hot directly, nuclear weapons were never used. The Cold War ended peacefully and on terms consistent with Western values and interests. Not bad. The costs of American foreign policy during this era were considerable. The biggest costs were actually not so much to do with the Cold War directly, but wars of choice that we chose to fight in Vietnam and so forth, Iraq, Afghanistan. But the benefits were extraordinary. And by the way, the costs never got in the way of what? Fantastic economic growth in this country, much longer lifespans, spread of democracy around much of the world and so forth. So I actually think what we've had is an enormous return on investment for 8 decades. But good things just don't happen. We learned that in science in high school. The natural way of systems is entropy. It's for things to come apart, not come together. The critical ingredient, not the only ingredient, the critical ingredient to historical accomplishment for the last 8 decades was this country. It was American leadership. The example we set, the policies we carried out, the order we designed, and we nurtured and maintained. And good things will not continue to happen without us. To the contrary, it will begin to unravel. And I don't mind orders coming apart. I'll say 2 last things, and I'll stop. But one, this is the first time in history I've ever seen a country decide to dismantle the order it set for itself. Normally, orders come apart for 2 reasons. They're overwhelmed by an opponent, or the country that built it can no longer sustain it. Neither one applies here. We are choosing to undo the world that we built. And I would simply say, and that's my second point and last point, you should only be prepared to do such a thing if you have something better to put in its place. Maybe I've missed that page in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal. I have yet to see what we have better to put in its place.
Okay, I want to connect. I want to connect your last point to what you said a little bit earlier. So, in terms of undoing the world that we built, you also talked about, in response to authoritarianism, that what our role should be is to frustrate the authoritarians. So the question, Richard, is, do you believe that Putin, Xi, and the supreme leader of Iran have been frustrated by the first 100 days of this administration?
3 different answers. Because there's 3 different...
That's why you're here.
Mr. Putin, no. Essentially, we've adopted what I would call, let's just call it what it is, a pro-Russian tilt to our foreign policy. Too many of our talking points are the English translation of Russian talking points. Let's just call a spade a spade.
Okay, this is actually really fun for me to now be able to push on this. We hear that a lot, but what are those? What are the Russian talking points in the administration?
Which was acquired Ukrainian territory, Ukraine became independent in 1991. Crimea, which was taken in 2014, should now revert to Russia. No, aggression can't be allowed to be. The eastern districts, the 4 eastern oblasts in Ukraine, the United States is saying that the referenda that were carried out there in conditions of conflict by Russia should count as legitimate, and these now should revert to Russia? No way. The economic sanctions should be reversed, relaxed. What has Russia done to earn that? I go down the list, but basically there's lots of conditions that the Russians laid out. More important, I applaud President Trump on one thing here. He has made getting peace in this war a priority. Good. The best way to get it, though, he's sabotaging. If you really want peace, the best way to get it is to persuade Vladimir Putin that continued war will not benefit him. The only way I know how to do that is to give Ukraine the arms and the intelligence it needs to support itself. It's not that complicated. And again, I was a critic of the previous administration. I thought we were saying to Ukraine, do anything you want for as long as you want. And I said, no. U.S. policy should not be that Ukraine regains its territory through military means. That's an impossible task. It won't happen. Might even be dangerous. But that Ukraine ought to be able to survive as a viable, independent, sovereign country. We ought to have a ceasefire. I've negotiated many of them around the world. We ought to have a simple, clean ceasefire that doesn't prejudice anybody's views about what we call in the Middle East final status, the ultimate disposition of territory. That's a long-term negotiation. But right now, we ought to give Ukraine the means to defend itself so Vladimir Putin understands that one more month or one more year or one more decade will not get him what he wants. If you want peace, si pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. That's the only way I know how to do it. I don't think it's complicated. So that would be that. In terms of we know less about this administration's China policy than any other aspect of its foreign policy. We know what it thinks about Greenland. We know what it thinks about Canada, Panama. We'll talk about the Middle East in a minute. We just talked about Ukraine. We know it's against the Paris climate process. We know it wants to mine the seabed. We know it's not interested in democracy promotion. We know it pulled out of the World Health Organization. I do not know what it thinks about China. You've got the tariffs, and we've got the confrontation there, but that's a means to an end. We have a desire to find an arrangement on TikTok. But I defy anyone to explain with confidence what our policy towards China is. So I think that's an enormous question, and it's a question mark. And in particular, given President Trump's tendencies, to what extent does he prioritize reaching an economic understanding with China? For example, that does something about the nearly $300 billion trade imbalance that he seems to think is a problem. And to what extent is he potentially willing to offset, if we get what we want economically, with something geopolitically? I don't know. That to me is a mystery. So I can't tell you anything there. Middle East, Iran might surprise you. Good, you're sitting down. I think the table is set for a deal. I think what the Israelis did in doing, in April and October, demonstrating Iran's inability to control its airspace, what they did against Hamas, what they did against, and more important, against Hezbollah. To some extent, obviously then the fall of the Assad regime in Syria after half a century, well, dynasty rather than regime. I think all that juxtaposed against Iran's economic weakness, I think has created an extraordinary opportunity. And what the administration has, against the backdrop of the threat of force, either by Israel, the United States, or both, is basically telling Iran, we have got to reach a very demanding nuclear agreement. And look, once before in its history, Iran has gulped deep. And that was to end the Iran-Iraq war. And the Ayatollah Khomeini said, this is like drinking poison to me, but I would drink poison to save our revolution. And I think for the second time in their history, they may be prepared to drink poison. And what the United States then needs to do is fashion a set of objectives that I believe give us what we need in a way that Iran can sign without being humiliated. I believe that needle can be threaded. I do think, and this is where I lose some people, Iran will need to be allowed to keep a very small amount of enriched uranium at a very low level with incredibly severe, demanding verification requirements. I would take that.
Why does it need to?
Because I don't believe otherwise Iran can accept the deal, and I don't believe that such an outcome is one that in any way would be inimical to American or Israeli security interests, because the parts of what Iran is doing like that could be verified. If they tried to cheat on that, I believe we would find out about it. The things they can do without our knowing, certain types of weaponization efforts and all that, no deal is going to be able to verify, because you can't verify every garage in Iran. But if you're asking me, look, negotiations are about what you get as opposed to what you give. And you've got to say to yourself, would we be better off with an outcome that left Iran with that? Or would we be better off with an outcome that meant going to war? Because either way, I think the outcome that has to be achieved is no Iranian nuclear weapon. Not just that. I would say Iran cannot be left on the threshold of a nuclear weapon. I don't want to live with Iran that is a week away, or 2 weeks away, or one in which we could be surprised. So I would say we need to create enormous space and time between where Iran is allowed to be and what it would need to have one or more nuclear weapons. And I believe it can be achieved diplomatically as well or better as it could be achieved militarily without some of the knock-on effects, above all, Iranian retaliation in various forms around the region.
So there were a lot of us in the first go-round on the nuclear deal who thought that the argument that the Obama administration made that it's either this or war, that was a false choice. Those weren't the only two options.
Yep.
And now we know that that's the case because it was this administration that put maximum pressure back on the table. So the question is, when you say that they want to save the regime, what does a tough deal look like? Are they prepared to give up enrichment? Are they prepared to move out the centrifuges? Are they prepared to give total access to the program? What does that look like? And if they don't do that, just last thing, if they don't do that, then going back again to so many of these arguments that we engaged in last time, then you're in a position where you potentially risk the start of a nuclear arms race in the region.
Well, again, devil's in the details. I would think the single biggest flaw in the JCPOA, the 2015 agreement, was the duration, the sunsets. It was a fairly demanding agreement. It kept about a year between where Iran was allowed to reach and what it would need for nuclear weapons if they dashed towards that. But you had sunset provisions. Well, what about an agreement with no sunset provisions, or maybe sunset provisions of a century? That, to me, would fix the single biggest flaw in the 2015 I don't want to see an Iranian nuclear weapon in 10 or 15 years. That doesn't leave me comfortable. So the first thing I would do is insist. That, to me, would be that. I would agree that it could be ratified by the Senate or approved by the Congress. That was a second. That's something the Iranians want. Again, if the inspections were sufficiently intrusive, the amount and level of uranium were basically at the modest to symbolic level, I would think we in Israel could live with that. Again, compared to what? So you've always got to ask yourself, I wrote a book recently called The Bill of Obligations. It's about how to complement the Bill of Rights and thinking about American democracy. And one of my 10 obligations was to be open to compromise. Not to compromise, but be open to it. So my point is, I think we ought to be open to it, and it's the compared to what? So if you basically set terms that Iran is unwilling to sign, and I think things that they would take as so humiliating they wouldn't sign, then I would say, okay, then think through the use of military force and where that leads you. If you're persuaded that using military force would leave you better off, both in terms of Iran's nuclear program, but more broadly, in terms of the American economy, the regional economy, the global economy, energy, the stability of Arab regimes, terrorism and all that. If you're persuaded, then fine. But all I'm saying is, I've looked at it. I think that depending upon the details of the agreement, we would be, I think, not just in an acceptable position, but in a preferable position to using military force, though I grant, again, the devil's in the details.
Last question on Iran, and then I'm going to move on to
I had the
to
crowd
Israel.
until I went into that. This is really sad. I know.
Just the last question here, though. Again, the difference now after and this will be a transition into conversation about Israel, the difference now is because of the success of the IDF against Hamas, against Hezbollah, Iran is now out of Syria. Israel withstood 2 strikes from Iran and then struck back and destroyed the air defense. Given all of that, the opportunity through military action to set back the program for that, or to, if not eliminate the program, is greater than it's ever been. How do we measure that in the calculation?
Well, the opportunity to set back the known program is great. The opportunity to set back the unknown program doesn't exist. You're not going to kill every scientist. You're not going to kill every weapons lab. You're not going to kill every possible repository of small amounts of of small amounts of uranium. They could have, for all we know, it's 16 garages around Tehran. They could have moved ahead on various weaponization, casings, triggers, and so forth. Indeed, I assume that. So you just have to ask yourself again, what are you likely to accomplish? And to think about cost, it's not simply what Iran can do against Israel. What about what Iran could do against Saudi Arabia, or what it could do against other countries? Again, we know the goal. The goal is to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. So or getting even close to them, as I said. So what we're debating is how best to accomplish that. What sort of means? What's our definition of success? So I'm not against the military option, per se. I think what you have to do is demonstrate really with intellectual rigor what it could accomplish at what cost, and how that compares to what you could negotiate and at what cost. And just be confident that again, we know the ends we want to accomplish. I've yet to see an analysis that demonstrated to me that was a preferable means. If someone can demonstrate it to me, I look forward to learning.
Well, will the Supreme Leader agree to an agreement that also addresses their support for terror, human rights violations, everything they do to disrupt the region, the threats AJC poses to the Jewish community, all of that?
My hunch is probably not. And what we would say, 2 things. I would say then, first, that to the extent we noticed any other activity that Iran was behind, we being the United States, Israel, or anybody else, that we deemed to be unacceptable, we would react against it. That even if you had a nuclear-related agreement, in no way did it tie our hands if Iran demonstrated by its actions that its support for proxies was not stopped. Second of all, we would tell Iran, we know that one of your motives for signing a nuclear deal is to ease your currency is plummeted, your economy is a mess, and so forth. We will have a scale of sanctions. And you will get limited credit in sanctions relief if we get what we want on the nuclear side. However, increased relief from sanctions will be linked to other behaviors on your part. Terrorism, supports for the Houthis, support for Hamas, Hezbollah, what have you. So there would be a kind of sliding scale. And then in that way, Iran will say, we will gauge our behavior based upon your behavior. It's that simple.
It's been 570 days since the horrific attacks of October 7th, and there are still 59 hostages remaining in Gaza. Diplomacy has been central to your life's work. You were special envoy to Northern Ireland in the period following the Good Friday Agreement. Hamas continues to wage war from Gaza. How do you move forward from here? What should the Israelis, how should the Israelis be approaching this? How does the United States approach this?
Sure.
How do you get the hostages home? How do you ensure that there is a way forward that doesn't include Hamas in Gaza?
Because now I'm about to alienate the few of you I haven't already alienated. Look, the Israeli-Hamas ceasefire had 3 phases. The first was implemented, was the most defined, a quasi-defined second phase, which required Hamas to give back all the remaining living hostages. Israel was required to accept an open-ended ceasefire and full physical withdrawal, military withdrawal from Gaza, then a totally ill-defined third phase, which was the future. I would argue that this Israeli government basically decided it did not want to go ahead with the second phase. Some of you may disagree with that, but to me, it reflects the unfortunate reality that for this Israeli government, again, hostage return is desirable but not the top priority. That's, to me, simply a fact of life. So, in no way does it let Hamas off the hook for what they did on October 7th or since, but I would simply say that. Let me make a larger point, though, since I mentioned Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland actually has a very useful lesson here. And let me quickly try to make the case for what I learned from it. And actually, a lot of this was done before I became the U.S. envoy, or then later the international mediator. When the British were facing this challenge in Northern Ireland, which was basically this communal challenge between paramilitaries on the Protestant, or what was called Unionist side, or Loyalist side, and on the Provisional IRA and others on the Catholic or Nationalist side. I'll try not, or Republican side. I'll try not to use their terminology because it's too confusing. The British had a really big insight under Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, something that crossed political lines. And essentially was, we have got to teach what they called the hard men, the terrorists. They would never be able to shoot or kill their way into power. And that required, obviously, a British military, British police, and it was brutal. Let's just admit that. But there was a second dimension to their policy. We are going to make sure they can never shoot their way into power. But secondly, we are going to open up a political process so that we can demonstrate to the people that there's a better way than supporting the guys with the guns if you want to realize some of your political ambitions. Not all of them, but some of them. And what they did is they opened up a political process that ultimately led to the Good Friday Agreement, and we'll see where, if anywhere, it leads in the future. But the big impact was obviously on what we would call the Catholic paramilitaries, the Provisional IRA, and people like Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams, who were principal figures in the IRA, which McGuinness admitted and Jerry Adams never did, became leaders of a political process. What is missing? The Israelis have half of this. The Israelis have used military force in a really direct, powerful, at times brutal way in Gaza, and have basically told Hamas, you will pay an enormous price for October 7th, and you will never, ever, ever be able to do anything remotely like that again. And I think that is half of the answer. What the Israelis have not done is marginalize Hamas politically. They have never introduced the so-called day-after strategy and say, if Palestinians are willing to meet the following conditions, let's lay out the conditions about nonviolence and other things, here is a path that will be open to them. Here's a door through which they can walk, and we will be willing to meet them on the other side. They're not going to get all of what they want. They're certainly not going to get all of what they want anytime soon, but they will get more of what they want if they choose this alternative path than if they continue simply to support Hamas. And what's so interesting, in recent weeks, we've seen some Palestinians with the stunning courage to stand up to Hamas. So I would say, what better moment to open up an alternative pathway and say, again, here's what we can offer you, here's what we require of you in order to start going down this road. And the Israelis have not been willing to do that. And as a result, this war will never come to an end, and the hostages will not come back.
Okay, there is a different approach. There's a competing narrative here that says only in this instance with Israel are we asking the country that was attacked to define a better vision for the people and the entity that attacked them, as opposed to virtually every other war.
But there's a fundamental difference there.
Virtually every other war I can think of, where first you wage war of self-defense, then ultimately the party that attacked you gets defeated, surrenders, and then people sit down, then the parties sit down to talk about the future. Why is this different?
Well, because there's no such thing called Palestine. This is not an independent country that fought a war with Israel. These are occupied areas and occupied peoples. So you have a wildly uneven status. And one. Two, I'm just arguing it pragmatically. Whatever you think. If you want to ultimately bring an end to the war, and by the way, if you don't want the war, if you don't want the West Bank to go the way of Gaza, which it is beginning to go, which is not getting the attention it deserves, but if you don't want to have that be the future, which I think for many reasons is bad for Israel, this is, take a step back. Whenever I argue this line, yeah, I think what I'm arguing would be better for the Palestinians, but it would be better for Israel. If you want Israel to remain a secure, prosperous, Jewish, democratic country anchored in the West, I believe Israel needs to go some distance towards trying to find an accommodation with Palestinians who are willing to meet reasonable terms. If you can't find those Palestinians, okay, you can't. But you've demonstrated that you tried. And historically, at times, the Israelis have done it, by the way. We've seen that. And Arafat and others missed important moments. And history ought to be, be brutal in their criticism of these so-called Arab and Palestinian leaders who blew opportunities that will never exist again. But we are where we are. And I simply think it's in Israel's interest, again, to offer a conditional path, without even articulating necessarily what's at the end of the path. Too much has arguably transpired for that to be done right now. But I don't think Israel is on a course. We can argue whether it's sustainable against the Palestinians. My question is whether it's ultimately in Israel's interest, and I have my doubts.
Last word on this, then I want to talk about the way that the world has responded to October 7th. There is, as you think about the way forward here, has there been enough of an outcry from the rest of the world? This will lead to the international organizations, but has there been enough of an outcry that has recognized that the single greatest impediment to peace in Gaza is the fact that it's been run by a terror organization that's taken billions of dollars meant to improve the lives of its people and have invested instead in building tunnels that it's used to launch these attacks against Israel?
Yeah. Your answer is no, but the rest of the world is focused more on October 8th, and Israel and the people in this room, for understandable reasons, are focused more on October 7th. And that is simply, it may be regrettable, it may be lots of things, but that to me is simply, where we where we are. And the question is, how do you change that? And again, to some extent, it goes into Israeli behavior in Gaza. And there are times I have been critical about how Israel has used military force there. But my bigger criticism of Israel is not what it's done, but what it hasn't done. Put the onus on the Palestinians to step up. And right now, I'll be honest with you, there's no leadership in the West Bank, and there's no leadership or constructive leadership in Gaza. So one of the things you have to do in negotiations when you don't have an opposite number that has effective constructive leadership, you have to say, how can I create conditions in which that has a better chance of emerging? And I would think, again, if Israel believes that some type of an accommodation with Palestinians is desirable, then I would say Israel wants to set forth conditions, create a context in which Palestinians who are willing to have that kind of a relationship with Israel can step forward and can step forward safely. Now, I say that understanding there's many Israelis now who don't want to have an accommodation with Palestinians. And like the Riviera plan and like transfer in the West Bank. That's a different political future. I get it. That's a future not of coexistence. I get it. That's a different one. But if you believe it's in Israel's self-interest, as well as in the interest of Palestinians, to have some type of an accommodation, then I think it argues not for, no one should misunderstand. Hamas is not an acceptable partner in any political process. You don't have a viable partner in the West Bank. So Israel's challenge, which is an odd one when you think about it, it's almost a pre-negotiation phase. Israel now needs to say and do things to create a context in which, in a couple of years or longer, Palestinians emerge who would be willing and able to negotiate a coexistence arrangement with Israel. That can't be done now, but people need to be thinking longer term. That is the task for Israeli diplomats.
Great. So I wanted to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience. I want to follow up on this last point about how to increase the pressure to make sure that the conversation changes, and you're considering a world where Hamas isn't in charge, where there's greater responsibility placed on the part of the Palestinians as well. The UN General Assembly passed resolutions in October and December calling for an immediate ceasefire that would have left Hamas in power. The U.S. vetoed 2 Security Council resolutions that also would have left Hamas in power, because none of them even condemned Hamas's October 7th attacks. They didn't mention Hamas's name. They didn't affirm Israel's right to self-defense. President Macron said that October 7th was the biggest anti-Semitic massacre of our century, only to then hear UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese justify the attack, saying the victims of October 7th were not killed because of their Judaism, but in response to Israel's oppression. UN Women, an organization that exists to champion women's rights, was completely silent on Hamas's well-documented mass murder and rape. Why, as we look at how to create a different future for Palestinians, why is the United Nations, why are international bodies so willing always to condemn Israel and fail seemingly always in this context to condemn acts of terror and violence against Israelis and the broader Jewish community?
Because it's hypocrisy on stilts. I mean, these are unserious places in many cases. When you have some of these countries, which are authoritarian countries or worse, on the Human Rights Council, how could anybody expect an institution such as that to play a constructive role in anything? Why should you care about their judgments? These are facile, unprincipled positions taken by a lot of these governments. So I see the UN as pretty irrelevant to to any future viable process. So I wouldn't give it a great deal of thought, because the answer is it doesn't have a constructive role to play. It's ruled itself out in most instances. The General Assembly, just given the numbers game, can't be taken seriously, to be perfect. That's why nothing of much importance happens there. And the Security Council, which is the executive arm of the UN, is now a function of great power politics and competition and controversies. So I don't see the UN playing a serious role here, or just about anywhere else. I'll be honest with you. If it didn't exist, it certainly would not be invented in its current form.
Well, that's an excellent jumping off point. I think there are microphones. No? Yes?
By the way, I can't arrange tours of the UN for anyone who wants them now. So you're on your own. You're on your own.
Well, we'll start with Bob. Yeah.
You have to wait for a microphone or not?
There it is, right in front.
It's coming to you, sir.
How would you go about creating
We'll repeat it.
We'll
Go
repeat
ahead.
it. Tell it.
How would you go about creating alternative governments to Abbas in the West Bank and to Hamas in Gaza? And secondly, as President Trump goes to Saudi Arabia for meetings with MBS, what should he be seeking to accomplish if he's seeking to expand the Abraham Accords? How far can he go in terms of providing military support, given that creates a threat to Israel? How far can he go in terms of a nuclear program? And how can he be of help in changing government in both the West Bank and in Gaza?
Okay, well, in changing leadership or government in the West Bank and Gaza, it's a version of what I said for Israel. I think the United States should have much more of a role than it has. And we should be willing to, again, we should set conditions and be willing to work with people who meet them. And we should be in favor of good governance within these places. And we should be willing to work diplomatically with people who meet certain conditions. We should be willing to train people. I like it when people come here and study and learn certain things about good governance. We should be willing to provide aid for certain types or assistance for certain types of programs. But mainly, we should say the United States is willing to work with you diplomatically, economically, politically. But here's our terms. You don't like them? Great. You don't have to work with us. You don't have to accept our money or support. If, however, you want to have our money or support, here's the criteria we require. And I think that ought to be our approach. And gradually over time, it might be something I would think we would coordinate with the Israelis to the extent we could. And I would like to see the emergence. We certainly need a new generation of leadership in the West Bank. And we need new leadership full stop in Gaza. But if you will, the old Palestinian Authority and the current Hamas these are not leaderships we can ever work with. So we ought to make clear what kind of leaderships are we looking for, and we ought to try to bring them about. And that's what I think. That again, it's investing and it's part of what foreign policy is. You want to incentivize certain things, discourage others, and that's what I think we have to do here. In terms of Saudi Arabia, I'd say a couple of things. One is one of the many, many reasons I don't want to see an Iranian nuclear weapon is I don't want to see a Saudi nuclear weapon. And I don't want to see several others. Just, anytime you think the Middle East can't get worse, trust me, it can. I do not want to have multiple fingers on multiple nuclear buttons. So I don't want the Saudis or anyone else. And that means the Iranians can't be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. We ought to try. It's one of, by the way, more broadly around the world, the single best, let me make a pitch here, the single best non-proliferation tool of the United States for 75 years, there's a word for it. It's called alliances. We have basically provided people confidence, security, in some cases nuclear umbrellas, so they didn't need nuclear weapons of their own. You want to see a world of a dozen or 2 dozen countries with nuclear weapons? It's where the United States is no longer a dependable security partner. Coming back to where we began the conversation, I would think about that. Look,
Are we headed in that direction?
it worries me. I think we're focused way too much on certain narrow calculations of what countries do. But I would think if, for example, South Korea might be 70 to 80% of people in South Korea now want to have nuclear weapons. Why? Because they're worried about the North, they're worried about China, and they're not confident in the United States. Well, let's just say South Korea begins to move towards nuclear weapons. What will Japan do? If South Korea moves towards nuclear weapons, what will North Korea do? Let's see what happens with Ukraine. Let's see what happens with the transatlantic relationship. If suddenly the United States nuclear umbrella is no longer enough, what will Poland do? Will countries be confident that the French and British nuclear deterrents can substitute for ours? I already talked about Iran, what the Saudis, the UAE, Egypt, Turkey might do. And the transition to a world of nuclear weapons, as well as a world of nuclear weapons, the United States and the Soviet Union managed nuclear rivalry, but it wasn't easy. And one of the ways we had it is because we had these enormous arsenals that could survive the other side going first. If you will, we might have a test case of this, by the way, I'm sorry to say, very soon. It's called India and Pakistan, which is probably the least structured nuclear relationship in the world. I worry about situations where you have vulnerable nuclear deterrents, not very developed relationships, poor communications, uncertain command and control, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to see that replicated in Asia, Europe, or the Middle East, but I digress. The last thing I'd say, I don't know, I think the Saudis were willing to enter an Abraham Accord-like arrangement with Israel before October 7th. I think October 8th and what's happened since has changed particularly young opinion in Saudi Arabia. So my own sense is the president's trip will probably focus more on things economic, mainly on things security. I would be surprised if anything could be delivered on, I hope I'm wrong, but I'd be surprised if anything big were delivered overtly on Saudi-Israeli relations, absent us reaching a different point in Gaza. promised to remind me of 1 and 2.
Hi. My question is, do you think that there could be, I'm right here. Do you think that there could be a, hi. Do you think that there could or should be a broader effort to hold Qatar accountable in the sense of them using Al Jazeera to actually shape public opinion against Israel and also housing Hamas in Doha while they are actually acting as chief negotiators in future ceasefire agreements?
Thank you very much. You mentioned Ireland, and I think there's a world of difference between an independence movement and a movement based on annihilation. And I think over the last 100 years, when you look at all the dots and you connect them with respect to the repeated rejection of every reasonable peace deal on the table for the Palestinians, to taking of billions of dollars of aid and developing a whole underground tunnel system, can Jews and Israelis and all their allies truly trust in the viability of a long-term Palestinian state that doesn't get hijacked 10 minutes after there's a reasonable so-called Palestinian government?
Thanks. One or two more. Who's got the mic? Yeah.
So for starters, I think you'd be happy to hear that you didn't in fact alienate me in your opinion of Israel.
Meeting's young.
But one of the things that you were talking about was how in the past few weeks, there's been a series of Palestinian uprisings within Gaza. But I think it's important to note that, what was that met with? They were mutilated, killed, and set as a warning or example for the rest of the people in Gaza, so as for that to not happen again. So how can we hope to institutionally reform this ideologically entrenched hatred of Israel and the Jews within Gaza without the complete eradication of Hamas?
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us. I just wanted to ask a follow-up.
I'm sorry. This is why I don't play guard for the Knicks. I have trouble with
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to your statement about, so many of us are concerned about the hostages and the hostage negotiations. And you made a statement about Israel's lack of prioritization for the hostages and that being reflected in their inability to bring us home, but I can't help but feel that the U.S. has a responsibility to bring home the American hostages, and could we be applying the same thinking to the American hostages, past and current administration? I'm really curious your thoughts there.
Okay.
And as you answer that last question, if it's a priority for the United States and the lead negotiator is also the lead negotiator on Iran and on Ukraine, how do you possibly make it the priority it needs to be?
Look, on Qatar, I think you have to look at all cases, the totality of the relationship, or Qatar if you prefer. There's things that are important in terms of basing military support, and there's things that give us heartburn. And the idea that you have a relationship that's not one-directional, one-dimensional is not unique to that, and you just decide how you manage it from our end. And the things that give you heartburn, you push back about, and you either try to incentivize them out of it, or maybe you penalize them if you can, or you decide you live with it. I think it's that complicated and that simple, but it's not unique to have a relationship where certain things the other party does give us heartburn and certain don't. The idea of trusting a Palestinian state, you'd set conditions, and then if those conditions were violated, like you would with any other actor. So you would have conditions, for example, I would assume, on militarization of any Palestinian entity, about presence of external forces, obviously about behavior, and where it violated them, you would make clear what would be Israel would make clear what would be the consequences. We would make clear that certain types of assistance or help would be only forthcoming if certain things would be done, would be suspended if other things were done. So I don't think you can guarantee the future behavior of any entity. you would just put them on notice that what would be the costs and benefits of either adhering to their commitments or violating their commitments. But one of the 4 presidents I worked for was Reagan. I'm a trust and verify guy. So, or in this case, don't trust and verify. You see what they do, and then you act accordingly. But I agree. If you ever do get to a Palestinian state or whatever, that's not the end of that doesn't solve. I hate the word solve. When I ran the Council on Foreign Relations, I used to discourage any of the fellows from using the word solve. Most things are not in the world are not problems to be solved. A much better terminology is conditions to be managed. So even if you get to the place which seems pretty remote right now, of a Palestinian state, it doesn't mean you can walk away and say, okay, next problem. No. A whole different set of challenges at that point, including the ones you rightfully articulated, and you would have to anticipate them, and you would have to deal with them if and when they arose. Now I have to read my handwriting about Gaza. Yeah, look, I agree. What happened the other day was sobering, and Hamas meant it as just to discourage or deter others from rising up. It's one of the reasons, though, people like me have been saying, you need an Israeli day after policy because you need an Arab stabilization force there. You need to create a new political, military, economic context. It can't be the IDF. You need an Arab stabilization force with a large Palestinian Authority component. And I use the word, by the way, it would not be a peacekeeping force. Stabilization force, peacemaking. You would have to kill Hamas at times, because Hamas would see an Arab stabilization force as an enemy. And you would then have to get to the point where the Hamas ability to affect day-to-day life was rendered to negligible. Eradicate, getting to zero is a big goal. I would simply say you want to reduce it to a policing problem. That would be the challenge of an Arab stabilization force, but you won't get an Arab stabilization force without a larger political package. Hence the incentive, I would say, for Israel to create a day-after political agenda. I'm worried that we're looking for a future of Gaza that has gangs and militias, a little bit of Hamas, a lot of the IDF. I do not think that is a good future. Can't read my hand. Oh yeah, the U.S. side. Sure. Look, I think it's. Could we get something separate? That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about it. Maybe. The question then is, what would be the terms? I'd have to think through whether we would want to do it, whether we should do something like that. I'd want to know what our leverage is and whether it was a price we were prepared to pay. Like certain types of things obviously you wouldn't want to bolster Hamas. Could there be certain things we would want to maybe sign on to in a humanitarian way if we were confident that the services would reach those who needed it? I would be open to at least thinking about that, but I'm thinking out loud here, which is a little bit dangerous. But I would certainly be in the question of whether Mr. Witkoff is overstretched. Well, he's a busy man, and like I said, I think there's a real opportunity with Iran. I don't think he can succeed in a constructive form with Russia unless the policy changes. Let me just make a larger point. I was the U.S. envoy to Cyprus as well as to Northern Ireland. I was involved in India-Pakistan diplomacy, a lot of Middle East diplomacy. And mediators or envoys, they operate in a context. And to some extent, the context is the realities on the ground. To some extent, it's the policy that's articulated out of the capital, out of the government you work for. So it's really, I don't look for Steve Witkoff to pull rabbits out of a hat. 99% of what he can do is going to be what's set, particularly in this administration, more than most administrations. This one is top down. Let's not kid ourselves. Steve Witkoff, Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, they are not setting the policy. This is a policy that's being set by the 47th president. And he's giving them their operational parameters. So if he turns out to be a good negotiator, fine. But what really matters is what is his brief. So I don't worry about him. I worry about what his brief is.
Great. We can take a few more. Yeah.
Hi. My question is about how do you think about the importance of democracy in everything that we're talking about, and what I the democracy of the United States. And what I'm specifically getting at is, as we have a country where we've had an insurrection and we have a possibility in which 4 years from now we might have a president continue to be the president against democratic values, how does that go into our foreign policy, which at least at its front is typically about capitalism and democracy?
Absolutely.
It's a big question, and it's the right question, so thank you. And look, here I am, and you invited me here to speak. You might be wondering why you invited me here to speak, but the ostensible reason is I know something about foreign policy. But in recent years, I've started writing and speaking mostly about your question. And there's a connection. If we want to see democracy around the world because we think it's desirable and the rest, the best way to promote it is by the example we set, not by diplomats with talking points. If we want to be effective in the world, we have to be strong economically. We're only strong economically if the rule of law applies here. You know, what ought to scare you? This is the first financial crisis in modern times where there's been flight away from the United States. Every other financial crisis in my memory, even those we caused, this would be the safe haven. This is the first time I've seen flight out of here, away from the dollar, away from American equities, away from bonds. That ought to scare you. Our ability to meet our domestic challenges depends upon our ability to work politically across the aisle and so forth. Well, if we can't, we're not going to have the bandwidth or the resources to deal with international challenges. So it turns out that American democracy is important in and of itself, as an end in itself. And here we are, you know, we're 15 months away from marking the 250th anniversary. So what better time to double down? But it's also central to our ability to be effective in the world. And unless we get American democracy right, we can't stand up for it elsewhere, and we won't be able to be effective, to lead, to act. If we're at war with ourselves, we simply will not have the resources and the bandwidth. And you know, there's always a kind of, and you remember this from your political career, a kind of latent concern that what we do in the world comes at the expense of what we do here. That's the origins of isolationism. Well, if things are bad here, no matter what the cause, an open border, as it was allowed to happen under the previous administration, crime, whatever, people turn away from foreign policy. They will say, we don't have the resources, we can't afford it, we have to focus here at home. So we need to be strong and orderly here at home so we can focus on the rest of the world, which, by the way, has the ability to come back and bite us if we leave it alone to fester. So for any number of reasons, American democracy is critical, not just to ourselves, to our wealth, but also to our ability to act in the world. And if I can make a pitch for one thing, no one should be able to graduate from high school or college in this country without having taken a serious civics course. Actually, can I say one analogy? Okay, Jews. Jews know this. Why? Think about the Seder. What is the Seder? The Seder is the institutional teaching of Jewish experience and Jewish identity. And we understood we have to have a Seder to transmit what it is to be a Jew. We don't take it for granted. And guess what? We survived for millennia, in no small part because of all those bad meals we've had over Seders. Well, it was a price worth paying. American democracy has to be transmitted just as intentionally. We've got to be just as focused. People aren't born. They aren't born knowing why democracy is good and what it takes for it to prosper or thrive. We have got to become intentional and disciplined in transmitting the DNA of American democracy, just as Jews are intentional and purposeful in transmitting the DNA of Judaism. But the Seder, Passover, that is a model for how conscientious we have to become here at home about American democracy.
Matzo balls and Constitution. I think that's
My next book. My next book.
Just one quick follow-up. When people understand civics, when they understand democracy here, they understand that there are 3 branches of government. If they don't know any of that, and they were looking at the current operation of our government, would they get a sense that all 3 of them are equally active?
2/3. They would get a sense. Obviously, Hamilton wrote, I think it was Federalist 90, I could be wrong on that, about the energy of the executive. Well, whatever else you think, we have an energetic executive. Any president who can worry about how much water goes through a shower head and paper straws is an energetic executive. So we have that. The court system is being tested. But I would say right now, Article 3 of the Constitution, the judiciary, is performing laudably. I can't say that about your former outfit. Article 1 is in the witness protection program. Let's be honest. What we are seeing is wholesale abdication of responsibility. 30 seconds about checks and balances are central to a democracy. What we're seeing at the federal level is an imbalance towards the executive. That is unhealthy. What we're seeing, the second set of checks and balances is Washington as opposed to the rest of the country. And there, again, we're seeing a struggle between states and cities on one hand and the federal government. Thirdly, the most interesting, I find, is actually what's going on between government and civil society. Universities, law firms, the media, watch that space. That's the other checks and balances in a democracy. And I worry about that. We were talking about it before. I was glad to see some universities band together, finally some collective action. Good sign. Much easier for a powerful executive to pick off law firms and universities and media organizations one by one. More difficult if they band together. So in unity, some strength here.
We have time for 2 more. Yep. Oh, sorry, with the mic here. Sorry.
Hi, hello. I'm Ron. I'm from the Czech Republic. I have a more controversial question. Very often, when we mention October 7th, we fail to recognize the similarities to 1973 Yom Kippur War. Outside attacker, problems on the internal political scene, the weak military who couldn't know how to respond, and then obviously the controversial prime minister. Do you think maybe that Israel, also given its current diplomatic state, should probably take a leaf out of its own history book and follow, for example, the road of Golda Meir?
And last question, where I don't know where the mic is. Okay.
I can use my outside voice.
You spoke a little bit about the move away from the sort of the liberal world order and towards isolationism, authoritarianism. I was wondering if you believe that when people don't have to struggle against authoritarianism, when they have it easy and laid out for them, then they want to start struggling against the liberalism, even if it's a good system that works despite its problems. Or if you think that the motivation, that there is a fundamental problem with the liberal order, genuine grievances people have, even if there isn't a plan afterwards. But people don't care about that. They just they want to get rid of it.
So take them both. The first one, look, there are some similarities. To me, the most obvious one is you tend not to see what you're not looking for. And I was party to that in the run-up to the Iraq War. We all thought Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. When he didn't let inspectors in, we assumed he was hiding the fact he had weapons of mass destruction. It turned out he was hiding the fact he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. But it shows you the power of a groupthink, of assumptions, a certain lack of humility and rigor. And I think Israel has paid for it extraordinarily high price twice. And I would just say that what makes a democracy is not that you don't make mistakes, is that you can face up to them, learn from them, and correct them. And that's the challenge facing Israel. October 7th happened. We can't bring those poor people back to life. Hopefully we'll bring back the remaining hostages. The real question is to make sure Israel doesn't have a third time in its history where, again, it lets down its guard because of assumptions, because of things that weren't passed along that should be, so forth, so on. And that's what, again, that's the great strength of democracies, is the ability to self-correct. And we'll see if Israel has that, but it has to then have an honest reckoning with itself. Before you can implement the lessons, you've got to learn the lessons. So we'll see whether Israel has the willingness to face up to what was done. And now I've gone on so long. Yeah, but there was some other twist to it at the end. Challenges of liberal. Sorry, I've.
Liberal democracy and.
Oh, right, got it. Yeah. Well, look, that's another lesson of history. And in some ways, it's the danger of populism. If people get sufficiently frustrated with the here and now, and they get so worked up about what they're against, they'll either be susceptible to siren calls of all sorts of promises or won't really care. They'll say anything is better. And by the time they learn that anything is not better, it's too late. In a sense, that was part of the problem of, and I'm always worried about ever using Germany as an example, but the Weimar experience. Some of what's happened in Argentina and so forth. It's one of the reasons I get nervous when democracy here doesn't deliver. Because when democracy here doesn't deliver, and if people grow anxious or worse yet, desperate, then they are more willing to turn to conspiracies and extreme quote-unquote solutions that are anything but. And it's one of the reasons that democracies, in order to stay liberal in the classic sense of the word, have to stay functional. They have to continue to deliver. When democracies fail to deliver, they're asking for trouble, which again is why I come back to things like civics, public service, and so forth. We need to make sure this democracy here continues to deliver, or people will be all too open to alternatives, and we're seeing that in the polls. Look at these polls at young people that show a shockingly high percentage of young people don't see the value of democracy and are prepared to live under some other alternative if they believe it would deliver. And these alternatives won't deliver what they think, but it will deliver a lot of what they're not counting on. And that's dangerous. And that's why, again, it's so important that democracy be made to work and shown to work.
Richard Haass, thank you very much for sharing your insight with us. We're so grateful.